All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes and community guidelines to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so, as well as a copy of the PDF presentation, and then a couple of extra resources for you guys. We're going to be doing a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send your questions in the chat box at any point throughout the presentation, and then we're just going to go through all of them at the end. And finally, we ask that you hold each other with mutual respect, come to this space teachable, and stay engaged with our presenter throughout this program. So now I just want to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York program, just in case you haven't heard of us yet. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and all other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. So to learn more about our services, you can visit us at dhpsny.org. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our presenter today, Andrew, to get us started. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Leah. Welcome, everybody. My name is Andrew Arpey. I am the head of Records Access Services at the New York State Archives. I've worked for the archives since the late 1990s. I've held a number of positions, making my way to my current position, which I've held for just shy of 2 years. My unit is called Access Services. It's responsible for a lot of the care and management of records after they're transferred to the state archives. Now, the archives takes records from state agencies, from all 3 branches of state government. We do not take personal papers, or we rarely, on certain occasions, have taken local government records on microfilm, but state government records, as I said, all 3 branches of government are what we get. We receive a lot of agency records, probably the bulk of our holdings by quantity. Our records of the major departments and offices and executive branch offices and constitutional departments like environmental conservation, corrections and community supervision, transportation, etc. But we do have fairly good representation from the court system, especially prior to the court reorganization in 1846. So that being said, please don't make the mistake of thinking that because we're the state archives, we're part of the state education department, that we have unlimited resources to work on records. We don't. But we have a budget that we have to conform to. The state archives has multiple programs, other avenues besides ours where funding has to be channeled to carry out services that we're legally mandated to do. So we're just part of the picture. We have to play nice with the whole organization. But our unit receives records transfers from agencies. We assess those records after they come into our house for needs and actions that we might take. We set those records up for public access by describing them and creating online finding aids, data which we record in archive space, but publish through a brand new tool that we'll be putting out called Archipelago, that was designed by the folks at the Metro Library Council. So we do EAD, encoded archival description, and we adhere very carefully to standards for describing archival records, and also for various controlled access vocabularies that we use in our descriptions to try and keep everything decipherable regardless of whether you're one of us or whether you're out in the general public or whatnot. And we have been making a concerted effort for many years now to try and describe our records and have our online finding aids be taken to the greatest detail, to the lowest level of description, container, folder, item, whatever is appropriate. Again, though, back to resources. That's not something that we can just do at the snap of a finger for any collection in the state archives. Some things involve a little bit more, but that leads us into what we're here to talk about today, which is processing priorities, setting goals for your collections. How does that work in our world? Again, just because we're large in terms of quantity, we have gone through many variations in our level of staffing, the amount of person hours that we have available to put into this. I mean, we struggle to keep up with our physical and digital storage capacity for the records that we could and should take in to our holdings. So anyways, break it down back to square one. What is processing in our world? How do we think of processing in the world of archives and in the state archives in particular? Well, we look at it as a set of actions that we take to improve intellectual and physical access to records. We look for deficiencies in description. We look for issues with housing. We look for pre-existing damage to records that was present when the records came to us, and so on. But our goal is to make these records, ideally every collection that we possess, discoverable, decipherable by our public users, and physically usable, physically accessible should someone want to come in to our facility and actually look at the records. The second major aspect of processing, major goal, is to set records up for long-term preservation. We are entrusted custodians of the historic state government records of New York, and we take that responsibility very seriously. I mean, we go to great lengths to try and at least stabilize every collection that we receive, to kind of stem any tides of like progressing damage from prior water exposure or burn damage or whatnot. Just we try to set things that have become our responsibility up for permanent, forever, a long lifespan. They're the historic record. I mean, if they weren't worth keeping permanently forever, they wouldn't come to the state archives. They would not have been appraised by staff in the state archives who reach out to agencies and work with them to set up records for either destruction after their legal or business value has gone away, or determined to be of permanent historic value and scheduled to be sent to the archives. Now, when we look at processing in the archives, there's a couple different ways that we look at it. Starting back in the 1990s, the state archives instituted a process of assessing every accession that we've taken into the archives since we first began receiving records in 1978, and extending that to every new accession that we took into the archives from that point forward, from say about 1998, still doing it in the present. When we first began assessing both the backlog and new records that we received, we did so in a homemade data system we called the Needs Assessment and Preservation System, or NAPS. we've ceased use of it. We've moved the data from that module over to archive space, which I will show you an example of in a moment. But this is an example of activities that we carry out universally to try and get a handle on processing needs of our collections, to try and make note of what types of physical formats or electronic formats, digital formats we have in our collections, because that informs the types of resources that we're required to process them. And in addition to that, logging quantities for each format. How much are we dealing with in say, UHF video cassette tapes, or compact discs, or rolled maps and plans, whatnot. Having those figures to turn to see what we're actually dealing with help us plan. So this is a universal activity carried out across. And while conducting that universal assessment, we take note of the other activities that we've talked about, specifically relating to access. You know, are these records that have come to us in such a state that we wouldn't know where to start? If someone asked us, how do I find, records of this particular date or of this particular person, official in these records, and we scratch our heads and say, like, well, as it stands right now, we don't really have any way. Complete disarray, disarrangement, and whatever. Noted as such in that initial assessment that we do. So we can plan later on resources available to address that deficiency and make the records more accessible. What kind of things can we do to stabilize records that the assessment reveals have been damaged, are moldy, or whatnot? It gives us a chance to prioritize, to basically rate issues that we see on a scale of, this is really, really bad, this is unusable, to almost there, a little bit of tweaking. And again, I'll show you an example of that in a second. Secondly, the second bullet point that you see on this slide refers to activities that are undertaken based on prioritization, the kind of things that I want to draw your attention to as part of this presentation, the reason why we're here. We have a lot of records, we do have a great staff, but as I said, we are resource limited. And so we have never been able to process ideally and completely every collection that was in our holdings at a given time. It's just never been within the realm of possibility, due to staff hours, due to supplies, due to physical digital storage, things that happen when records expand due to rehousing and whatnot. We've never been able to do it full scale. So we analyze and we prioritize. The accession level assessment of all collections is a really, really excellent means of gathering the type of information that helps inform prioritization decisions. If in your institution, if you implement a program to make this kind of assessment, a needs assessment of your backlog of records and anything that comes into your house new to be added to the collections, make that a given. All collections, a basic assessment of physical condition, of available access tools, if the collection's larger than a single box or a single volume. If it's multiple, do you have the type of access information available that will allow you to help the public, your users, access the records or not? Is it something that would have to be created by your staff? in order to exist. And you also take into account in doing this across the board assessment of collections, a level of anticipated public interest. I mean, no one has a crystal ball, no one is a fortune teller, but, we put our heads together, we talk about it. We think we have people who have been here almost since the archives opened, and people with new perspectives who have joined the archives more recently. We put our heads together and talk about, do we anticipate there being an interest in this particular set of records? If we publish a finding aid, if we we publish a monthly report of new accessions on our website, if we put it out there, do we think, people are going to look and say, hey, I think that's something that would help me in my work, either doing genealogy or doing historical research or legal research, what have you. So those are the kind of the general areas that that across the board assessment should really touch. And now I would like to. Can you see the screen? Leah, is that visible, this particular?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, just making sure. This is the assessment screen in archive space. Archive space is open source. I'm not a compensated endorser of it. We actually had multiple homemade systems in the state archives up until about 4 years ago, when we basically no longer had the means of updating or enhancing those systems. So we migrated to archive space, both our finding aid, data and our assessment data. This is an assessment screen for a series in the state archives of Revolutionary War accounts and claims. And you can see we've selected a set of descriptive tools, characteristics that allow these records to be accessed, that promote the public's ability to understand them and our ability to help the public understand and access them. And so with a new series, we would check whatever has been provided to us by the transferring agency that fits these criteria. I mean, are we given a box list of record content or volume content? Is it better? Is it a folder list? Have we created a finding aid for it? Have we, fleshed it out and so on? This makes up basically the description assessment component that we did for all of our backlog and we do for all new transfers to the state archives. Some housekeeping stuff in there. Basically, the assessment information aspect of the form down here allows us to really get down into the nitty-gritty of the physical status and the access status of the records. We have a rating system in place here of 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest quality in that particular category and 5 being the greatest. And you can see there's some assessments were done, some were not. We had cases where we had no exact equivalent from our prior system to the archive space module here, but myself, I wouldn't agree with all of the assessments that have been done here. I find that the intellectual interest in this is pretty high, is higher than I think it's given credit for here. This is a set of financial records, basically, that the state comptroller's office amassed in figuring out how to settle its debt after the Revolutionary War ended. You know, the state ran out of resources. It began issuing basically IOUs, promissory notes to various vendors and to the militia, military, and whatnot, that they would pay, that the state would pay their debts as soon as possible. So we have this large collection of all variety of records that were compiled to make those financial transactions possible. And lo and behold, the records were very badly burned in the New York State Capitol fire of 1911. A goodly percentage of them were destroyed altogether, period. The ones that survived are burn damaged. That's the kind of thing that an assessment would note, and any actions that had been taken prior to transfer of the records to the archives should be noted. We also in our form have this capacity to indicate the formats that are found in a given accession. So if we become concerned that a certain format that's been in our holdings for longer than an X number of years is going to be degrading, like an audiovisual format, we can use this type of assessment data and our finding aid descriptions in hand to seek out those collections that have those at-risk formats. So again, part of the across the board assessment. So as I said, it isn't necessary to have like an application of this kind, but this type of assessment being done on all collections is very important in terms of being able to decide what collections to focus processing on. Now, the next step, how do we take this type of resources, this type of information that we've gathered for our collections and act on it? Well, in the archives, we have a large enough staff to be able to pull together a group that we call the records task planning team. I mean, in a small organization, that the duties of that team might fall on one person, but the role that this team performs, that it fills, I think is important for any organization to fill with whatever staff capacity that it has. And our task planning group basically solicits suggestions from all staff at any level who have come upon something in using collections and providing access to the public. Things they've stumbled upon a collection. Oh my God, this is in just horrible shape. They would submit to us using a form that I'll show an example to you in a second, to the team of a project for consideration as a potential enhancement improvement project of the condition, access, physical. It could be all of the above, could be one of the above, depending on the need. But our staff member will fill out, depending on the nature of the records, a fairly detailed assessment of the problem to be addressed by a processing project. And the major factors that we look at, the things that our antenna are up from the time records are transferred for the rest of their lifespan, but particularly in deciding what to funnel resources toward in an actual processing project. We look at the risk to long-term preservation if nothing is done, if nothing or if minimal action is taken, we look at anticipated public interest, of course. I mean, as I said, ideally we would like to work on every collection that we have and put it in optimum shape for the long haul. We don't have the resource to do it. So one factor is, do we think this activity, this processing project, will fulfill a potential public interest, will actually take an inkling that we have that the records will be of interest and kind of finish the job and actually make them of interest, because people can begin to use them and word can begin to spread of how rich they are. Something that maybe like we didn't know how to get into, or we were afraid to let people handle because it was unstable before. We've approved a project, we've taken steps to stabilize and arrange and whatever might happen to be needed, better describe, box folder lists, digitization, if that, seems to be a good way to go. Lots of things to enhance our ability to connect the public with the particular set of records. And every project that we look at, we always stop and think, who's going to do it? We have regular daily routine work that is going on all the time, as is. Is this project significant enough that it's going to add a major work burden to one or more units in the state archives? Can we bear that burden at this time? Or is it something that we're going to have to take a pass on and put off for a future a time when, other things are completed? Maybe there's more time, more staff, and so on. Of course, we're going to look at, like, depending on what type of product we're shooting for with the processing, if it's more than just publishing a better finding aid, if it's in the realm of digitization for of paper records for inclusion in our digital collections, what resources are going to be required to make that happen, both in terms of staff and in terms of storage. And physical supplies, space to work on a collection that's particularly bad, particularly involved. We've taken up entire rooms at the state archives working on processing projects that we deemed important enough to get several people involved in doing and spread things out so we can get a handle on a poor arrangement and correct it, do some indexing along the way and at the time, and put the records in a much better place. So it's always a factor. Do we think the project will succeed? If we fear it'll grind to a halt because it's too ambitious for the current times, we're very likely to take a pass and focus more on things that we can realistically achieve. I wanted to show you. This is a records task proposal form that the archives uses, that we make available to all of our staff to complete, to submit a project proposal to the records task planning group. And it has spaces for information about the exact kind of things that I just walked you through that the group will want to consider in deciding whether or not to take up a project, to get into it. Things such as, the format and quantity of the records, where they're located. Is this something we're going to have to go off-site? We do have multiple off-site storage locations because our collection is large. Are we going to have to, at one point or another, bring back each box of 250 that are off-site in order to do this? It's a consideration. The lay of the land as the person submitting the record finds it. I mean, you see a legacy of NAPS information that's being replaced as we speak by the archive space assessment information. What kinds of resources has the submitter drawn upon to support this proposal? What kind of evidence are they presenting that the situation with these records is, as they say it is, bad or sort of bad? And resources, tasks, things that we need to account for, special supplies, uh, inter-unit cooperation. Do we need our digital record services unit to chime in regarding storage of digital records, either born digital or copies, if this is like, a project of that nature, and so on. And then, some housekeeping information as far as proposal and completion dates. And therefore, I wanted to just throw out some additional factors that come into play in determining processing priorities, things that we face here. They might not apply to all of your organizations specifically. Us being a state agency, an executive branch agency, we do have certain obligations as far as freedom of information law is concerned and whatnot. But as I list out, we have been known to, we have put forward a special effort to stabilize or better describe, better account for the arrangement of records if we've had a specific research inquiry, or if like we have someone who is participating in our research residency program express interest in a particular series that we have, but which we know is problematic. We may, to facilitate that research, try to undertake a project to render it more usable. As I alluded to a moment ago, FOIL requests force us into series of records at times that can be, not our most favorite to have to dig into in order to comply with a FOIL request. That could be an additional factor that could kick some work into action on the records to enable us to fulfill that request more easily. We participate in social media at the archives, and we do get suggestions from our social media team for certain themes that could be better supported by making new records available, digitized, so they could be included in social media posts. That's at times has kicked into action some projects to get a better handle on and digitize, better describe records so they can be used. The same can be said for exhibits, either online or physical, where we get into a set of records motivated by a particular theme. We want to do an online exhibit or a physical exhibit that corresponds to a particular commemoration going on at the time. And we start digging around and we see something that will be fantastic, but it's in such a state that can kick into being a project to stabilize something or digitize something to make it more accessible in the end. And the last one that I wanted to mention was grant funding. I mean, there's grant funding out there for certain themes, for certain types of projects. I'm not an expert in it, but I've done work that several times that was supported by grant funding, which allows us to hire either some outside help or allows us to pay for vendors to either process or preserve records or digitize records, special formats like audio visual that we're not able to do ourselves in the state archives. We do not have the equipment for that at all. So that kind of thing can open doors to some really, really nice improvements in access and, handling. Lastly, I just wanted to throw out a few examples of things that have been dealt with in depth, during my time at the State Archives, because for some of the reasons that I've been taking you through for the last half an hour or so. And the first example on the list here are incarcerated individual case files. We've received, oh God, the State Archives has somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000 cubic foot boxes of case files of formerly incarcerated individuals. We're the State Archives, so it's individuals who were in state prisons, namely felons. We have case files dating back to the 1920s, forward to the early 2000s, the latest paper transfers we've received from the agency. We used to lump these case files together kind of into a bulk parent accession. And it was a bear, as someone who fielded plenty of requests for these records back in the day, trying to sift through this massive pile of records to find out where records of a particular facility, of a particular prison, correctional facility were located, could take loads of time. And once that's done, to even get lucky enough to find a file for the inmate that a patron, someone out in the public, is searching for, again, a maybe. You find the set of records and you dig box by box. We decided that as a project, as a processing project, we would divide up all of this big giant pile into individual record series by correctional facility, and place any new transfers that we get from the agency into these facility specific series. We have over 60 of them now, that many facilities. And while we were doing that, we went the extra mile and created indexes, and they're in varying levels of publication as far as putting them out to the public. But in terms of data gathering, we've created indexes for just about every accession that we've ever received of incarcerated individual case files, which is a huge, huge boon to access. Makes things so much easier on our staff to at least locate the files. Second item on the list, executive clemency records. We have records going back to the 1920s of applications to the governor's office for pardon, clemency, commutation, restoration of citizenship, all different types of executive clemency within the power of the governor to grant to people who were either currently or formerly incarcerated. And we just have hundreds of cubic feet of these records in horrible disarray, files spread amongst several boxes, unfolded, just individual documents. We decided that the wealth of information available in these records, able to fill gaps in the incarcerated individual case files of people for whom we never received a file, never will. We literally took over an entire room and had staff doing rudimentary flattening, refoldering, and creating case files for individuals, document by document, putting them in order by application number, which is roughly chronological, and rebuilding the series box by box with an accompanying index to it. So if we have a file, we can find it. Another one, which is near and dear to my heart, one of the first projects that I participated in here, was an item level inventory of the original New York State Capitol building plans and drawings, where myself and other staff went through every single oversized plan, an architectural plan or drawing related to the construction, enhancement, maintenance of the state capitol building here in Albany. Put them into a reasonable, understandable order because they were just filed, folded them for proper long-term preservation, and made an item level inventory so they're accessible by name of architect, by date. We even did some condition assessments while we were into all this stuff. So if one's drawings that were in particularly bad condition could receive special treatment and so on. The last one that I want to make a note of is something that's very important to the archives, but is a real bear to get a handle on, and that's our audiovisual, our analog audiovisual records. I mean, we've been receiving them since the archives opened. Cassette tapes, UHF videotapes, reel-to-reel videotapes, VHS tapes, beta tapes, all variety of audiovisual 33 1/3 LP and other size LP phonographic records. You name it, we've received them, and we don't have the capacity in-house to play them, period, let alone play them without damaging them. And so many of them are simply not accessible to the public in their current state. We undertook, one of our archivists who's an expert in the field undertook a massive assessment to root out the collections in which these AV records are found, and to note formats and quantities and dates and things like that to give us a sense of, geez, as far as shelf life goes, how far out are some of these records? The answer is pretty far, pretty nearing a point of no longer being usable, no longer being capable of digitization. They would have deteriorated so bad. But funding is only allowing us to have a certain amount of these digitized by an outside vendor, but we have gotten a much better handle on what we actually have. We've done item level worked inventories to prepare many series for possible shipping out and digitization if resources allow. So 2 parts of the same project, one doable, which is the assessment, the other a little bit harder, which is rendering them accessible through digitization. And I'm really dry, so I'm going to stop there, Leah, and just if anybody has any questions.
So we don't have any questions in the chat box yet. So we're gonna wait for folks to start filling those in. So yeah, everyone, chat is open, so go ahead. We do have one person who's raising their hand, so I'm gonna allow them to verbally ask their question. So this is Emily. Hi, Emily, you can go ahead and ask your question now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was actually gonna type my question and I don't know how I wound up raising my hand, so let me lower it. But I can go ahead and ask my question. So I really like the assessment screen in archive space. I didn't even realize that was an option in archive space. Is that something that's ever published, or is that always just in-house?
We don't publish it. It's not something that we would ever make like openly public, and we draw from it to inform other conversations and actions that we take, but we definitely don't use it as a publicly available resource.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure. And it has there's location information and stuff like that in there, and whatever other stuff that we just we can't put that out.
We do have a question that's come through from Annie, and this is, would you be willing to share the records task proposal worksheet?
Yes.
Okay, so we can send that out with the post-program email that you will all get that has the recording and the PDFs and all that good stuff.
Let me confer with, I will do that. I will confer with the person who heads the records task team, because I know she was revising the form. And I think we have had discussions with John and DHP of possibly making something available for use.
All right, cool.
So I will get in touch with her and I will get, an updated version of that.
Great, thank you. So next question is, how did you deal with the idea of original order when reorganizing materials for easier access?
It's a tough call sometimes. I mean, there were cases where we were fairly certain the original order was lost, and we were fairly confident that we were restoring it. There were cases like with the capital drawings where we just had no idea how long it had been before anybody looked at the collection as a set, much less thought about how to arrange it. It was just, just piles and piles of stuff that we figured we could arrange in part by format and size to put like materials together, and in part with some sort of order to make things a little bit more reasonable to retrieve documents from the same era from common folders, rather than one be at the beginning and one be at the end. It's a tough judgment call. We've had inmate records, like inmate index cards that we've received that help provide access to case files, or serve in their stead where we didn't receive case files. We had a set that we had received by inmate number, because that's how the facility had some index, some means of accessing them that way. We did not. And the requests that we receive from the public typically do not either. They know the inmate's name, and they might know what facility they were incarcerated at, and maybe the decade, rough time frame. And they'll ask us. We reprocessed, rearranged that series alphabetically by inmate name so we could access it. We just bit the bullet and said, we can't help anybody with this. We try to preserve original order wherever possible, but some of the access nightmares we've had, we just had to impose something that would allow us to provide access to the public. Judgment call.
So our next question is, how often do you do these basic universal assessments to keep your understanding of the condition of the collection up to date?
That's a good question. I mean, we took care of our backlog years ago, and there are probably some assessments in there that could use to be revisited. Like the AV ones have been revisited as part of that focused project, but there's other stuff that haven't. If something hasn't been suggested as a specific project, its assessment probably hasn't been revisited. So we catch everything coming in the door, but there are things that were, at this point in time now, were assessed 25 years ago that could probably, resources allow, could use another look, with a mind for, things that are possible now that maybe were possible at the time. It's a good question.
Our next one is, I haven't used archive space yet. The indexes your staff created for the incarcerated individual case files. Is there a place to retain that in archive space, or do you maintain it elsewhere? And if so, where?
There isn't a good place in archive space, because that's really geared toward creating EAD toward the finding aid side, rather than encoding a name index, like create an index to a set of records that resides apart from the finding aid. There isn't really a good place. We put a lot of thought into this, and what we ended up doing is we created a web feature in Drupal, the environment that our website is published through, to create online name indexes. And we're undergoing a web migration in the education department, so we have a lot of things waiting in the queue, and we're hoping that we can find a better means of publishing them, because they are XML data, similarly in the EAD is XML data, but they don't conform to the EAD standard. They have other types of metadata nested in each index entry. So, long answer to your question, outside of archive space.
How do you finally land on what you will tackle next? Is it a greatest desire for access, most troubling condition, doable scope of work, or some sort of rubric Venn diagram of all three of these factors?
I think it's closest to the latter. I think, like, we try not to pick things that we've really strongly fear that we will fail at, that we won't be able to get through, or that'll be so time consuming that it'll grind to a halt, and everybody who was involved will forget about it. We try to pick projects that are sustainable, even if they don't, aren't brought to completion in 3 months, even if they take longer, they're sustainable. We can keep interest and resources going toward them, keep them alive, keep them going. I think, we really try to factor in whether or not we're going to get some sort of a bang for our buck out of a project. Are we going to be able to expose the public to something really interesting after we do this work on it? Or is it are we just doing it because it needs to be done? Not that that's an awful thing. Like I said, ideally, everything would get, but we don't have the resources, so we tend to lean toward things that will have a benefit in terms of our user community, their interest, or like some sort of upcoming, like, exhibit or need or something that we feel the records will fulfill if we do the work on them. I think those are most important, possible, and something that, we're going to get some bang out of. And, even with the AV stuff, we try to list out everything that was in danger of obsolescence. Everything, every article in every series that was in danger of no longer being digitizable, if that's a word. We tried to do that, and we simply couldn't support it. It was too much. We don't have the resources to digitize that much, and to then take in the digital files and do all the post digitization work we need to do on them to set them up for long-term preservation. So we've had to revert kind of to a, user interest sort of ball game with those as well. So those are tops.
Okay, and that kind of flows nicely into our last question for the session with AV. So we have reel-to-reel film and VHS tapes, and we need funding for digitizing. Where is a good place to check for resources? John did share out the DHP grants earlier in the chat, but if you have any other suggestions for folks, please feel free to share.
I don't know the best examples there, but I have a colleague who did a lot of the assessment on these records that I could consult and get the answer to Leah and have her share it.
Yeah, absolutely. We can share that out. Okay, so we're just about at time here. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out. Andrew, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. This is actually DHPSNY's
I hope
This
it
is
was.
DHPSNY's last preservation or last presentation for the year. So thank you everyone for being here for our sort of grand finale for the 2024 season. So I hope you all have happy holidays and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you all.
Thank you all.